I took a seat in the second pew for my husband's funeral. It's not the first. That area had already been subtly reserved through posture, looks, and the kind of icy dancing that doesn't require announcement. His second marriage children crowded the area, all dressed in the same oppressive shade of navy as though they were born into it. Then, as if I were some forgotten prologue rather than the woman who previously created his life beside him, someone I'm still not sure of leaned in behind me and said, "You must be the first wife." I didn't look back. I didn't wince. I simply gazed at the coffin while carefully folding my gloves back into my lap. The memory table did not have a photo of us. The years we spent together prior to the start of his second existence were not mentioned. The software did not include my name. Not once. Evelyn Morrison is who I am. My age is 71. It dawned on me at that moment that someone had already erased me. It wasn't death that had erased me, but a more subtle force. A collective forgetting. The kind that begins with ease and finishes with brutality. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments section after you subscribe. Regards. At the age of 24, I got married to Charles Morrison. He was a 28-year-old school teacher whose smile was memorable due to its crooked teeth and kind eyes. Both of our girls are now adults. I left with dignity when the marriage ended, not in a dramatic or scandalous way, but just out of quiet dissatisfaction. 5 years later, he was married again. She was younger and more adept at throwing dinner parties. He has a son from her. They occupied a larger home. One features a formal dining room and columns. But no one ever saw the decades I spent repairing our first house, working part-time jobs while he completed his degree, baking birthday cakes with uneven icing and sewing drapes out of cloth I found at thrift stores that is not discussed in the eulogy. Those pictures are not framed. Neither the music nor the flowers are what I recall most about that funeral. My own silence is what it sounds like. I said nothing to anyone, not my daughters, not his son, not the woman they all referred to as his real wife. Despite the fact that he and I didn't get a formal divorce until 2 years prior to his passing. After that, stayed behind. The church reverberated with emptiness, and everyone had gone. I whispered farewell to a man who had held my hand beneath the table at a wedding when we were hardly older than children. And I touched the edge of the altar. I wasn't crying, though. I wasn't damaged. I was still, because I knew something that none of them did at that very moment. I was aware of the contents of his most recent will. When he visited without alerting anyone, 3 months prior to his death, I was aware of what he had told me. He had shed some pounds, appeared worn out. On the porch, we sat. "I've made some changes," he remarked. "I must tell you, I apologize for taking so long." That day, he went out in silence. No hugs, only a nod, and I didn't tell anyone. I allowed myself to be seated in the second row for the funeral. I allowed them to mutter their tiny labels. I gave them a guess. Because sometimes the truth can be found by just waiting for it rather than by speaking it out loud. Silence has a peculiar majesty to it. Furthermore, allowing people to be themselves is an even odd form of justice. His youngest son gave a brief speech close to the reception area after the funeral. And I stood by my car. "Dad loved us all so much," he continued. "He also had the best years of his life thanks to Mom." People gave courteous claps. I remained motionless. I still have the gloves he got me for our 7th Christmas in 1981. Leather in navy blue. Now a tad too tight. Nevertheless, I wore them. Later that evening, when I was by myself in my tiny apartment with the chipped kettle and the sofa from the thrift store, I took out the envelope he had sent me a week prior to his passing. The original will wasn't this one. The lawyer would take care of that. It was his handwriting, though, skewed, known. Additionally, he had put the following at the bottom, behind a little paragraph that said, "I made things right. They'll be taken aback. However, I'm sure you won't be." He was correct. I wasn't shocked. I'd known this was going to happen for a while, and I didn't feel like an afterthought for the first time in decades. I had the impression that I had only waited until they were spotted again. As a mother, you don't keep score. Birthdays are counted, not favors. Instead of spending hours sitting in waiting rooms or going to school, you commit shoe sizes and allergies to memory. At first, you don't consider the expenses of continuing to say yes. You simply do it out of love for them. However, if I could go back in time to those years, you would see me at 29. Sewing sequins onto a ballet costume at midnight because the store-bought one didn't feel special enough. At 34, I would be expecting our second daughter. Buying groceries with coupons and exact change while Charles was upgrading his car stereo. When I was 42, you would see me getting up early to pack his lunches and iron his shirts, because he detested how the cafeteria made his sandwiches wet. Those items are not recalled by them, not at all. However, I do dot every time you run your fingers across the seam. You feel the tiny hole, which I recall as being like a pinprick in fabric. I didn't become upset after Charles and I parted ways. I didn't demand additional money or fight for the house. I meant it when I stated, I just want the girls to have stability. One of those squat little houses with yellow siding that often looks a touch damp is the one I rented. I purchased a used couch. I wanted something in my life that was still in bloom, so I planted roses outside. My youngest had the flu one night. Perhaps in 1996, right before her math final. She was shivering under 3 blankets as I sat with her all night reciting formulas out loud. The following morning, I pleaded for a retake with her teacher over the phone. At first, he replied no. I recall how my voice broke, not in rage, but in desperation. The retake went to her. I passed, decided to pursue a career in finance. I didn't purchase anything new for myself for a number of years, not even socks. They got everything. School excursions, camps during the summer, braces for teeth. Additionally, I took care of Charles when he neglected to send his portion, which was more frequent than I admitted. Silently, because pride is a luxury you give up early in life as a mother. The girls would occasionally question how Daddy was able to afford the large home with the granite countertops and garden swing, because that's his house. I would answer with a smile. And this is ours, even when the bitterness simmered like tea left on the stove for too long. I never allowed them to hear it in my voice. Every birthday was handcrafted by hand. I would make the cakes myself. On napkins, write brief messages. I reminded Charles to call for a couple years using politely worded notes. He did occasionally he didn't. However, I always made sure the girls had something else to occupy their time as they waited by the phone, such as a coloring book, a card game, or anything else. It became quieter as they grew older. They became into opinionated teenagers with headphones. However, I remained steadfast. They had part-time jobs, and I drove them there. I provided assistance with college essays. When they departed, I packed their belongings, and when they couldn't see me, I sobbed in parking lots. I made no reciprocal requests, only the odd phone call, a postcard, a picture of them grinning. They eventually ceased mailing those as well. I wasn't invited to birthday parties for a few years after Charles got married again. I was not informed about graduations or school productions. His new wife enjoyed entertaining, and I believe she wanted her family's picture to remain clean-cut, with no extra outlines, no reminders of the previous events. I did, however, send gifts I could still recall. On envelopes, I continued to write their names in cursive and include brief remarks such as, "I loved watching you dance when you were 5. The video is still." With me, they didn't ever reply, not once. I am not sharing this with you out of sympathy. This isn't what it is. This is simply the reality. The kind of truth that hums on calm days and sits inside your ribcage. Maybe I imagined how much I donated, I thought at one point. It might not have been as much as I thought, Perhaps I was just a regular person. However, on the night my oldest had an asthma attack, I would open a drawer and discover a folded hospital bracelet, or a piece of paper that I helped glue together after midnight that had dried spaghetti stains on it. I would also know that it wasn't small, simply wasn't noticed. Love doesn't make noise, particularly the love of a mother. The ironing is the problem, the waiting. It's the ability to discern when to remain silent and when to advance gradually. Additionally, I didn't yell at the kids when Charles moved on and they unintentionally followed his example. Still, I continued to love them. Time heals everything, so the saying goes. That is untrue. Time is not a healer. It dulls the sharpness and softens the edges. But the wound's shape is preserved. I still get that agony when I hear a certain song or smell a certain perfume. It's the kind his second wife used to wear. It's the pain of being swapped out for convenience. Rather than malice, the most painful thing is that there was no conflict. It was forgotten. I also never resisted it. Not in words, not with rage. I chose to wait instead. I awaited something that I doubted would ever materialize. However, I continued to appear. They no longer informed me of birthdays. For holidays when the card did not include my name. For the kind of parenthood without a stage or a claim. Because even back then, I understood that in the end, the little things are what really count. The forgetting doesn't happen all at once. It starts out subtly and is first simple to overlook, much like a draft beneath the door. This is a missed call. There's a belated thank you. Even though you recall all of their birthday cards, this one never arrives in the mail. They're busy. You tell yourself you're being overly sensitive. You flip through the calendar page and continue. However, the pain builds up. With stillness, not with sound, I believed that we would get closer after the girls moved out. I saw mother and daughter, spending time together in coffee shops, on long phone talks, and on weekends, as is occasionally depicted in movies. A new teapot was purchased, the hopes that it would feel more inviting if they spent the night. I even painted the guest room a light shade of green. They DIDN single quotes T initially. Work, boyfriends, brand new flats. I got it. Really, I had once been youthful. The world seemed to require your undivided attention, or else it might depart without you. However, years went by. Additionally, I became a suggestion in their lives, a name that was saved on their phones but never used. A box has been checked. On Christmas, they would send out a group message. Merry Christmas, love you. Without any additions or punctuation, I always gave a unique response. I added a recollection, something to let them know I still thought of them as people, and said, Merry Christmas, sweetheart. I hope the tree turned out just like you wanted. As my kids, they never responded in writing. I learned about the birth of my first granddaughter via a Facebook post. A blurry image of a new mother's thumb encircled by little pink fingers. I spent nearly an hour gazing at that picture. Not that. I wasn't content. Yes, I was. But because I was unaware of its imminence. No call, no go-to. There isn't even a note stating that she is present. In any case, I crocheted a baby blanket, soft yarn, rose and cream. Welcome to the world, little one, was the tag I tied to it. 2 days later, I mailed it. Your grandma loves you. I never seen a picture of it. I never received a thank you. Perhaps they gave it away. They may have stored it in a drawer. I will never know. However, I can recall every stitch. At that point, the Christmas invitations ceased to arrive. My daughter came first. Charles, after that, used to go every year, being careful to avoid getting in the way and causing trouble with his new wife. I would bring a pie, sit close to the room's edge, and quietly chuckle at the tales I was already familiar with. I believed it was crucial to demonstrate that I had no resentment. To demonstrate that kindness was more important than pride, if only to myself. I called one year to find out the time of dinner. My daughter paused. Take a breath. Oh, I think we're just keeping it small this year, she added. I asked no more questions after that. My Decembers were peaceful after that. A series of quiet evenings. I continued to light the same candles, hang the wreath on the door, and prepare a little plate of mashed potatoes and ham. But the hall was empty of footsteps. There were no coats thrown over the banister. Just the creak of old floors, recalling a time when they could support more. The sigh of the heater and the sound of the kettle. Little things hurt. For example, they began referring to Charles's wife as Mom in public. Even in my presence, I would be grinning behind my program in the back of a school performance when I heard it, that sardonic, upbeat mom, emerging from the throng. Not for me, though. Not for me. She was deserving of compassion. It's not that she didn't. However, I carried them before they could breathe. When they were ill, I held their hair back. I remained awake during every grief and illness. However, somewhere down the line, that proved insufficient to secure a spot. They forgot I was vegetarian during one Thanksgiving. I had been one for almost 2 decades. However, the beans were cooked in bacon, the stuffing contained sausage, and the dinner roll was the sole item left uncooked. I said nothing at all. I assured them it was all excellent and moved food around. My plate. That evening, I recall sitting on the edge of the couch, unbuttoning my skirt, sobbing into a napkin in the restroom, and then smiling as I left. We do that, after all. I'm liked by women. We keep our voices steady, wash away the minor humiliations with tea, and swallow them like pills. Charles, too. He also grew quieter. Our discussions became less frequent over time. Every time he called, he would begin with, "Hey, just checking in," as if he were performing a silent duty. But once, just once, I heard something in his voice that wasn't duty. It was the week following his son's vehicle accident. "I just don't know how to get through to them," he added. Now, you know how it feels is not what I said. Just keep showing up, I urged. However, I thought to myself, I did, for many years. To be where I ended up. In the back of my closet, I kept a shoebox. All of the cards I had ever written that were never mailed were inside. I purposely failed to send the birthday notes because I knew they wouldn't be important. They left pictures at my house. One ballet slipper. "I love you" scrawled in blue crayon in 1987. Sometimes I would open the box to remind myself that I wasn't insane and that everything had actually happened. I had been everything to someone that one time. I was a footnote now. A fading thread. The problem with silent aches is that only you can hear them. They don't appear in documents or disputes. You cannot say they're pointing to them. I was broken by that thought. However, they reside within your body. They appear when you cease anticipating phone calls. The way you squirm during family events, unsure of your position. They tell you that your existence is an annoyance, which is why you gradually fade away, not because you want to, in their view. I had already disappeared by the time of the funeral because of this. It didn't hurt as much as it used to when they referred to me as his first wife, since I was already aware of the truth, to be eliminated. You don't need to be disliked. Being too quiet, too gentle, or too eager to let others tell the narrative is sometimes all that is required. There was no slamming door or harsh punishment for the ultimate treachery. The courier delivered it just after 9 on a Tuesday morning. A man in a beige uniform was standing outside my flat with a clipboard. With a courteous smile, he gave me a big envelope, as though I were signing for a book, catalog, or gift. He said, "Signature, please." However, none of those things applied here. Before I even opened the letter, I recognized the lawyer's stationery. With the envelope perched on my knees and my heart thumping softly at my ribs, I sat on the edge of the couch. I took a while to open it. Rather, I gazed at the sunlight streaming down through the slats and stripes on the floor. Be calm, not bothered. Even light doesn't have to know everything. I recall thinking, I discovered a stack of paperwork clipped together when I eventually pushed my finger under the seal. Additionally, in sharp black ink on the front, notice of Morrison Estate Power. of attorney. The list did not include my name, nor as a contact, nor as a beneficiary, and not even as a copy of politeness. However, the names of my girls were the one who still lived in that large white house with the swing I once painted by hand, the house where I had first planted tomatoes years ago, when we still believed in eternity, as well as Charles's second wife and kid. To be sure, I read the letter once, twice, and a third time. All three of them, my daughters and his new wife, had signed the letter, which was dated for months before he passed away, 4 months before that porch visit, and 4 months before he sat next to me and declared, "I've made some changes." They had filed to quietly transfer some assets before his health deteriorated too much. They must have known. Then they also made an effort to outshine it. It wasn't theft in the criminal sense, but it was worse. It was sanctioned betrayal, the kind you carry out with notaries and paperwork, concealed behind formal language and timelines. Not everything? No, but enough. A retirement account, a property deed, a life insurance policy that he hadn't yet restructured. My girls participated in it as well. I was broken by that. At first, I didn't even feel angry. Instead, I felt a gradual, growing stillness, a gaping void inside of me that I couldn't rationalize. What does it mean to be brought up like a mother and then subtly removed like an outsider? I didn't even taste the potato I boiled for supper that night. And I washed the dishes slowly and painfully, letting the water run over my hands for too long. I stood at the sink and looked at the wall, wondering, what else have they taken? What else have I allowed them to take? Because permission was ultimately what it was. I had shown them how to continue as though I didn't need anything. And they believed me when I told them that my love was unconditional, even if it meant losing my name, my dignity, and my station. The deed to my small apartment, the fated divorce decree, and Charles's first will written in 1983. When he was still wearing button-down shirts that I ironed myself, were all in the old accordion folder I kept in the back of my wardrobe, and which I took out that evening. On the table, I arranged them all up. I got to reading. I'm not sure what I was looking for, but it might have been evidence that I had existed, that I hadn't imagined the decades we spent together, or that my name had once mattered on paper rather than simply in memory. Something odd caught my attention in those pages. An ancient divorce agreement clause, K initialed but not signed, and faintly visible despite being struck through with a blue pen. As long as the relationship stays amicable, Charles Morrison agrees to notify Evelyn Morrison and involve her in health and estate management matters in the event of a serious illness or incapacitation. It had both his and my signatures next to it. He had never taken it back. My heart didn't rush. My chest didn't hurt. It just settled as I stayed there until 2 a.m. Following the line with my gaze, I was aware of my obligations. I wanted the truth to be known properly, legally, and not to them yet, but to someone who would listen without acting as though I didn't exist. I didn't want to fight, confront, shout, make claims, or tear anything away. I brought everything: the envelope, the old files, copy of the letter Charles had sent me weeks before he passed away, the one in his handwriting that read, "I've made things right." The following day, I made an appointment with a lawyer, not a family friend, not someone who owed them favors. It's just a woman with neat nails and a sharper mind than mine. Her brows raised only once as she read quietly. "Would you like me to pursue this?" she asked. Looking up, I just nodded without asking what this meant. I suddenly recognized that the ultimate betrayal had not been the documents, the power of attorney, or even their attempt to separate me from a guy I had already formed a life. With it had been a much simpler betrayal in the end. It happened when my girls, were my own biological children, sat across from a lawyer and acted as though I hadn't left, that I was no longer important, that their mother was no longer me. They crossed the final line, which I would never be able to uncross with them. I didn't call them again after it. Happened not with malice, but from a more powerful source, clarity. The quiet wasn't abrupt. Rather, it was a gradual, methodical unwinding, like to removing a thread from an old sweater. You don't tear it. Instead, you loosen it, one loop at a time, until you have something foldable left. I started the silent process of withdrawing instead of creating a spectacle, sending angry messages, knocking on people's doors demanding answers, writing letters in red ink, or leaving voicemails shaking with anger. That was never my style. My phone was the first thing I used. My daughter's names were still listed with little hearts next to them. A habit I picked up when texting became the new way to say, "I love you." I took the hearts off, then the pictures, and finally, the numbers. I did this one morning after cleaning the kitchen table and placing my teacup by the window. The fact that my hand didn't shake seemed odd. I put the phone down again and sipped my tea. I didn't flinch as it lit up for the first time in years. I then unsubscribed from every school newsletter and alumni update that I had signed up for when they were teenagers. I had followed school calendars long after they had stopped requiring me, so I could ask questions like, "How was the parent-teacher night?" even though I wasn't invited. I had followed every graduation, fundraiser, and small bulletin board notice. That brought me closer to their world for years. To unsubscribe. Click, click, click. The silence, the type that hums beneath all the noise, was beginning to seem like home as I sat on the porch that evening and listened to the wind stirring through the dried leaves. I didn't turn on the radio or phone anyone. I didn't have to attend any of the proceedings in person. But the lawyer handled everything with the same quiet assurance I now carried in my own bones. The lawyer had started the process of reviewing Charles's updated will. There were delays, of course. There always are. His second family asked for clarifications, and one even attempted to argue undue influence. But it didn't hold, and I planted lavender while they entangled themselves in rumors and distrust. I simply liked the way it grew slow, steady, and soft, like a woman who had nothing more to prove. I'm not sure why precisely. Silence can be a decision, a form of power, or the reluctance to continue bleeding for those who have never learned how to bandage a wound. Silence is often thought of as passive, as the absence of activity. I knew the dates by heart, and I still do. I also knew what kind of cake they liked and what gifts would have made them happy. I would find myself in the toy aisle, stopping too long by the puzzles and storybooks, almost reaching for my granddaughter. But then I would remember the baby blanket I sent that was never acknowledged, the pictures I never got, and the names I was never called. There were times when I wanted to break it, and I'd turn around and leave, just with finality, not with resentment. The way the neighbor's cat came to my backstep every morning, the precise shade of gold the sky turned before rain, the gentle crack of the spine when I opened a library books, all honest and selfless things that didn't require anything of me were among the things I teed. I started to notice in the silence. I started journaling once more. But this time it was for myself, not for them. I wrote about my first apartment, the first time Charles kissed my wrist rather than my mouth, and the day my oldest drew me a picture of our family holding hands in a field of flowers. I wrote until the page blurred and the pen ended. However, I never sent them a letter. The quiet wasn't a punishment. Rather, it was a barrier, one they were unaware I had set. I didn't want to send anything into the emptiness, nor was I casting out nets in the hopes of receiving a response. A single red chair in a field of snow. Stark, honest, alone. Lone, but not lonely. I replaced the photo collage in the hallway one Sunday. That included photographs of them as babies with gapped teeth and skinned knees. With a painting I purchased at a thrift store. Naturally, I saved the pictures. I put them in an envelope and kept them in the drawer next to my bed. I occasionally looked at them before going to sleep just to remember what it was like to be needed. However, I gave up on hearing their voices, stopped listening to my voicemail, stopped hopefully checking my inbox, and stopped checking my email for something that never arrived. On Wednesdays, I began working at the library. A young boy, perhaps 7 years old, always wants me to read to him. He doesn't know my name. He just refers to me as the story lady. That's more than enough. Being noticed doesn't always come from the places you gave everything to. Sometimes it comes subtly from those who owe you nothing and offer you everything in return. That's what I learned from the silence. I've tried to be kind, helpful, and inviting for the majority of my life. I'm just here now. No more stretching across a void in the hopes of being selected. No invitations, no explanations. Being loud is not necessary for me to exist. I am aware of who I am without their acknowledgement. And I discovered something more satisfying than closure in the silence that followed all those ignored calls and pointless getaways. I started my own business, and for the first time in decades, I understood its value. There comes a time, subtle, almost imperceptible, when sadness ceases to be a burden and turns into a door. It doesn't open with a big show, but rather quietly, with a slight change in perspective or a breath of fresh air you haven't experienced in years. That's what happened to me. I began to move differently. It wasn't rebellion or retaliation. Rather, it was a softer type of remembrance of who I was before becoming a mother, a wife, and the person who other people forgot to include in family portraits. I started with my hands at the community center. I took a ceramics class once a week, on Thursdays at 6 o'clock. I didn't tell anyone, not that anyone was left to tell. The studio smelled like wet clay and lavender cleaner, and the instructor had paint under her nails. She never asked me why I was there, just gave me a lump of earth and said, "Let it take shape." So I did. I kept my first bowl, which was uneven and crooked next to the basil I had kept alive for 3 years on my kitchen windowsill. It wasn't perfect, but it was mine. Before long, I began walking different routes. Passing the same houses and taking the same sidewalks, habits developed over decades, but now I turned left where I always went right. 2 blocks over, I discovered a bakery that sold the most delicate apricot scones. And I began reading books by the window there that I never had time for when the girls were little and my husband came home with a hot and ready dinner. When I saw a young mother hurrying past the bakery window with a toddler in tow and a swinging diaper bag, I didn't feel sorry for her or envious. Instead, I took a sip of tea and thought, you won't be thanked enough, and one day you'll stop expecting it. Her eyes were tired in a way I remembered too well. I began dressing for myself once more, simply and thoughtfully. I went through the back of my closet and discovered items I had stashed away for occasions, like linen pants, a silk scarf, and a soft gray coat with wooden buttons that I had purchased in Edinburgh on a trip I kept a secret from everyone. I also put on lipstick again, a subdued mauve shade, just enough to remind myself that I was still here, still capable of being soft, and still deserving of being reflected. Around this moment, Charles's attorney called. We've finalized the revisions. It's all in place as he intended. You'll be receiving formal documentation shortly, he said in a steady, courteous voice. I simply thanked him. I didn't ask any questions or elaborate. Charles had left me a piece of the estate. Not a fortune, nothing to make headlines, but enough to secure my quiet life, pay my rent for years, pay for the little things without looking at price tags, and confirm that, in the end, he saw me again, even if no one else did. The truth was, I already knew what the papers would say. More important was the way he left it, clearly, explicitly, legally, without misunderstanding, without mistakes, without a favor. Without acknowledgement, my daughters must have felt something. Maybe anger or perplexity, but none of them called not to dispute nor to apologize, and I didn't seek out either. I heard that the fallout was muted. His wife's acquaintances muttered and his son pouted. The season of justifying myself was done. Rather, I made travel arrangements. I stayed at a bed and breakfast run by a woman with silver braids and too many cats. And I spent just 4 days in a seaside town I had always wanted to visit. I walked along the coast, let the wind undo my hair, and collected smooth stones in my coat pockets. I didn't post pictures or text anyone from the edge of the cliff, and I'll watch the tide roll in while thinking about the version of myself that Used to sit at kitchen tables and hold back tears over forgotten anniversaries and cold dinners. She had waited too long to love herself, that she had loved deeply. I was starting over now. I got a puppy when I got back home. Snuffy terrier mix named Howard from the shelter. He follows me around the house and snores like a man twice his size. He only asks for my presence, which is something I'm now willing to do after all these years. Give love where it's felt, not just where it's expected, was written in my handwritten will, which I used to leave what little I had. 2 groups that fed starving children, funded libraries, and kept elderly women company. Would you like to notify your family? Asked the lawyer, a new one this time. A younger woman with sympathetic eyes and heavy glasses. I shook my head and grinned. They taught me how to exist without saying goodbye. So I said no. These days I light candles in the evenings not because of tradition or nostalgia, but simply because I enjoy the way the flame flickers against the wall, play old songs. SIPT from the mismatched china set I used to keep for unanswered guests. And let Howard lie up next to me on the couch. I'm not resentful. I'm conscious, leaving the responsibilities. You were given and creating your own, focusing on being entire rather than useful, can bring a sense of calm liberation. I consider all the versions of myself I've carefully buried beneath this one as I go through these slower, richer days. No longer striving for inclusion or acknowledgement, the ghost, the wife, and the mother. And I'm grateful to everyone for living long enough to get me here. Absence doesn't make a sound, doesn't kick in the door or leave a hole you can point to. It just takes away warmth. The kind of warmth you don't realize you depended on until it's gone, like when the pilot light goes out. The air is still in the room, but it no longer comforts you. That's how absence works. I was the pilot light, always glowing in the background of their lives silently. Then I wasn't. Not because of what I stole, but because of what I no longer contributed. It's okay. The gaps appeared after the will was resolved and the estate was divided more equitably than they had anticipated. I used to bake the strawberry cake with vanilla frosting and decorated with tiny candy stars. I had the tin, the same one Charles had once purchased for me at a flea market back in 1983. The first ripple occurred when my oldest tried to plan a family birthday celebration for her daughter, my granddaughter, to be held at the same park we had visited annually since she was born. That tin never left my kitchen. They requested to use it, naturally. The message was sent via a cousin who said she wanted to know if you still had the cake tin, for tradition's sake. I just ... didn't reply. I didn't do it maliciously. They began to sense the silent recoil at that point. That same cousin who was always meddling in other people's affairs informed me that the store-bought cake at the celebration had crumbled because it was too sugary, and the icing had melted before the candles were lighted. In a half-guilty voice, the cousin said, and she cried, "Your daughter." Just for a moment. I think she thought you'd show up still. However, I didn't, because you learn not to wait at the edge of the frame after being requested to stand outside the picture for a sufficient amount of time. They also lost the default. I was always the backup plan, the person who would watch the kids when things didn't work out and answer the phones late at night when someone needed help paying their rent or was sick. Quietly and without fuss, they had been accustomed to depending on me without realizing how much I weighed. They now found no one who knew how to keep quiet with them when issues arose, such as when Charles's son was caught stealing from the office or when the youngest suffered a miscarriage. No one would say the appropriate nothing as I used to do. Just be there and be steady. They tried. I'm sure they did, but they were raised by someone who always buffered life for them, and that someone was no longer in orbit. Now, they had to relate those stories to each other. But it's not the same when the listener isn't. It's the one who initially carried you through fevers and worries. I heard that Charles's wife began to host less, that the large dinners shrank, that the disputes were louder, and that the stress increased more rapidly without the gentle glue of calm. I used to bring with my pies and my silent hands folding napkins. There was no one to notice when someone Was drinking too much, or when a child appeared to need a break from the commotion? Or to ease the pain of awkward silences, just like the aches used to? Those tiny things mount up when I passed my younger daughter in the farmer's market one day. We gazed at each other for a moment. She appeared exhausted, opened her lips to speak, perhaps out of habit, then looked down before leaving with a bag of peaches that she was holding too firmly. When her teeth were loose, I used to slice them for her, skin off, and I wondered whether she remembered that. That night, I pictured her peeling one, the juice streaming down her fingers. Most likely she did. However, remembering and reaching out are two different things. Nor then, nor once did she call. Through the few relationships I still had, I heard whispers that my children were fighting more these days, that holidays were broken, and that old grudges that I had been suppressing for years with soft distractions and pleasant smiles were coming to the surface. I was no longer present to take the blow. Despite how odd that may sound, I didn't enjoy any of it. When love is at stake, there is no satisfaction in being proven correct. I didn't offer rescue, though they had based their entire existence on the belief that I would always be there, that my dedication would be limitless, and that I would continue to show up even when no one asked, when I was diminished, and even when I was abandoned. They assumed that I would be on the other end of the telephone all the time. The line was now silent. Some would argue that the only true difference was money and that they didn't lose anything else. However, I was aware. The birthday card with your childhood nickname, the comfort food left on the porch, the text message that comes right when you're breaking, the memory that only a mother would recall. Us is more than just being there, and everything was gone. Even me. Pride prevented them from saying it out loud, but they sensed it, like a house after a fire, where the walls are still there but the place doesn't smell familiar. I believe they anticipated that quiet would be brief, a phase or a lesson, but when silence turns into a haven, it is a form of protection rather than punishment. I suddenly realized how much I had given them in that area, and they hadn't even noticed. Without me, they would have lost something irreplaceable because they no longer had a mother who prepared meals, called or tidied up after them to their most vulnerable selves. They lost the witness, and nobody ever regains that. The rain had been falling for 3 days. But it wasn't the kind of overwhelming storm that comes with thunder and makes you feel alive. Rather, it was a slow, gentle rain that makes everything seem more genuine and gentle. It pattered on the windows like someone tapping softly to get in. And I let it in. For weeks I had been considering drafting a letter. Not to Charles. Not to them. Not to my girls. And not even to the me they left behind. But to the woman I had nearly become, the one I saw fluttering in windows, mirrors, and dreams. In quiet moments throughout the years, the one who never stopped waiting. The one who once thought that love, if given fully, would always return in kind. I opened a drawer and pulled out a sheet of thick, cream-colored paper, stationery-eyed. Been saving for a letter I never thought I'd have the courage to write, and sat at the little desk in my bedroom that morning. The one Charles and I had chosen when we were newlyweds, back when we believed in oak furniture and forever. I opened my fountain pen and started writing. Greetings, Evelyn. For many years, you held your breath in the hopes that they would remember you as more than a service, more than a softness, and more than a safe place to land. You waited longer than most people would have. You were mistaken, but not stupid, because love, even when it goes undetected and is poured into people like water into a broken vase, is not foolish. You were his only witness, the only one who saw him before the suits and the promotions and the house with the columns, the only one who sat with him on cold linoleum floors eating noodles from chipped bowls, the only one who held him when he thought he would never be enough. They called you his first wife, and they meant it as dismissal, a label, a way to file you in the past tense. There is a difference. You loved, and you didn't lose. They fled, they forgot, but you stayed. Not as a ghost, but as a garden. And Now you're finally beginning to grow again. You found your edges again in that choice. The silence you chose was not a sign of surrender. Rather, it was a reclamation, a drawing of lines where there had previously been only open doors and worn-out welcome mats. You stopped showing up where you weren't seen, and you stopped offering softness to those who mistook it for weakness. You discovered who you are. Do you recall the times you sobbed quietly into the pillow? The times you reminded yourself not to be dramatic, or the ways you kept your sorrow like folded clothing, keeping it hidden, necessary, and unnoticed? Now you can let that go. You don't have to bear the consequences of their silence. You don't have to make up excuses to fill the void. You don't have to defend, justify, or soften your departure. You just walked away, and that was precious in itself. Let them question why, label it frigid, and make up tales about a mother who drifted and grew aloof. You are aware of the reality. You came back to yourself. You didn't stray. Let the past remain folded in drawers where it belongs. Let the stories fall where they may. Don't alter them, and let the pain be just that, a pain, not a chain. If they ever tell your story, they might omit the important details, like the cake tin, the stitching scissors, the fevers that lasted till dawn, the murmured lullabies, the silent perseverance, and the unasked forgiveness. You'll know, though. You are constantly aware, and that knowledge is sufficient. Love, leveling it, was still raining when I was done. I didn't cry. I didn't grin. It wasn't that type of moment. I read the letter again carefully, as if it were supposed to be read out loud, as if I were reading it to a woman sitting across from me. Someone I finally knew. It was truth sliding into place, and it went beyond emotion. I slipped the letter into an envelope, carefully folded it, and put it in a wooden box next to my bed, tucked under a handkerchief with my initials stitched on it. I didn't intend to mail it, show it to anyone, or even address it. Then I got to my feet. I also took a breath. This was the sort of release that only occurs after decades of suppressing what you didn't know how to say. I had gotten my first installment from the estate a week earlier, so I had enough money to live comfortably. But I wanted more than comfort. So I went to the post office the next day with a donation check instead of the letter. I wanted to give what had been denied to me, recognition. I wrote, "For the women who are forgotten too soon." In the memo line of a donation I made to a program that helped single mothers return to school. I prepared a roast supper for myself that night, not as a celebration, but as a ritual. I used a linen napkin to set the table, lit a solitary light, played an old record with a skip in the third song, and ate leisurely, gratefully. And without loneliness, it was neither a spell nor a key, and the letter did not solve all the problems. However, it was a silent page-turning, a shutting dot, a choice to cease gauging my value on their approval, and to start living like I already mattered instead. Since I did, I had always, they simply were unable to see it. Now, though I could. My house has a stillness now, not the aching or echoing sort, but the kind that settles, like dust in sunshine, like water in an unopened glass. And it envelops me every morning when I wake up and stays every evening when I draw the blankets to my chin. When I'm ready, I get up and greet Howard, who is sleeping curled by the foot of the bed. He stretches his legs, blinks at me with drowsy eyes, and follows me into the kitchen, his tiny claws tapping softly against the floor. He expects nothing but presence, and I give it to him. My days start without any rush, no alarms, and no voices calling from other rooms. It's now my corner, my reading chair, my place to think, where I journal every morning with a quiet cup of tea and allow my mind to wander through memories, some sharp, some softened by time, all at last at peace. I've moved the armchair close to the window where the light is the softest, put my books within reach, and placed a wool blanket on its side. The world seems louder than I can handle these days, so I don't watch the news much. However, I pay attention to the birds. 2 robins have been nesting on the ledge outside my window for weeks, and I've watched them build, tend, and wait. I've come to realize that waiting is not weakness, but rather a form of wisdom that most people learn too late. But not me. Sometimes I choose the long route home, strolling aimlessly by homes with wind chimes and shoe-lined porches, imagining the complex, noisy lives that are filled with laughter and maybe solitude. I don't envy them. I just watch. I purchased a small gardening shed in the back, painted it a light blue, and filled it with pots, soil, and wooden shelves. I grow lavender, mint, and occasionally tomatoes for myself, not for anyone else. I enjoy bringing life to the earth, and even though no one gives the gardener credit, the flowers still bloom. The librarian who saved me the newest mystery book, the woman from the ceramics class who once lost her husband and quietly told me, "Grief is just love that has nowhere to go," are some of the people I occasionally receive. Letters from, however, I also receive postcards from museums and coastal towns, which I display on my refrigerator as mementos of a life I'm still creating. The lawyer completed everything months ago. There were no calls or appeals, just stillness. It came as a complete stop. Not like a wound, but more like the last period at the end of a lengthy sentence. I penned my second will during that quiet period. It had nothing to do with money. I donated the piano to a school, the furniture to a shelter, and I asked only that the painting of the red chair in snow be hung in a quiet hallway. I also left my journals to the local library, in case they ever wanted the ramblings of a woman who learned too much too late. I wrote letters to go with it, brief, quiet reflections on what mattered and what didn't, not out of resentment. But since you don't offer seeds to people who trample gardens, I left nothing for those who forgot me. If I had one wish, which I suppose we all have in the end, it would be for them to remain motionless long enough to experience what I did once. Not sorrow or sadness, but recognition. To see a picture in a drawer, a recipe written in a handwriting that I knew, a lullaby that I half remembered, and to realize abruptly and profoundly what had been lost. However, it's okay even if they don't. I no longer rely on being noticed by people who have chosen to ignore me. I see myself now as I sit in the silence. I like my tea strong, with a little milk and 1 sugar cube, and I brew it every morning. I no longer wait for the letters and the dog that lays his head on my lap and lets forth a peaceful sigh. And occasionally see a woman who has persevered through the gradual disintegration of a life and put it back together in her own time and shape in the mirror, where I no longer look for youth approbation or a sense of belonging. She was once referred to as his first wife at a funeral as if it were a footnote, and she allowed them to believe it because she knew the truth was already subtly permeating the documents. The passage of time and the very fabric of her being. I don't share my experience with many people, not aloud or in its entirety, but occasionally. I smile and say something straightforward, like I'm just living quietly now, and that's enough. When the cashier asks what I'm doing or the woman next to me in yoga remarks on how calm I appear, they constantly nod. And I believe they may know more than they admit. Beside me, Howard snores softly while I'm writing this. The scent of rosemary and cinnamon fills the house, and the flooring are glowing gold from the window light. I have warm hands. I've finished my tea and I am... For the first time in years, I wasn't upset. At last I was empty. And that was lovely.